Welcome to Activity 5. In this video, we're going to pick up where we left off after our last video tutorial when we built our users table, our register form, and our login page. So what we're going to do in this video is build our save registration page where we can create new users in our database. Let's get started. So I've got our site homepage up and running. My XAMPP server is running. I've opened up XAMPP, but I've started my Apache server and my MySQL web server. And if in my browser, I open up our homepage, my localhost sites to see, I can click on My Sites and load the list of sites with our images from our database. So in our last video, we created register and login forms, but we've really just built these pages. We haven't actually built any of the code to process these. So if I try to log in right now or try to register, if I submit my form, it loads a save registration.php page, or tries to load it, but we get a 404 not found error. So in this video, we're going to build this page and get our code working so that we can actually save new users to our database. Let's jump into Visual Studio Code. So in our code editor, I'm going to click on New File, and I'm going to create a file called save-registration.php. It's going to be all lowercase. And the first thing we'll do on here is put both our header and our footer, as we've been doing on all our other files. So we'll require our header.php at the top. I can just copy that line. I'll paste it and I'll change at the bottom, header, the word head, I'll change to foot. So this way our site header and site footer appear at the bottom of our file. We'll set up a main tag like we did on our other pages with a classic container. And now we can start writing our PHP code inside that's going to take the username and password, as well as the password confirmation entered on our previous page. We're going to validate the inputs. We want to make sure none of them are blank. We want to make sure our password and confirm password both match. And if all of that is working, we want to connect to our database. We want to hash the user's password for security. And ultimately, we want to save them in our users table. So I'll just go back to MySQL Workbench. And if we look right now, we run a quick query, select star from users. We build our users table in our last lesson. If I run this command, we'll see I have a table here, but it's empty. There are no users currently. So once the code on our save page is working, we should be able to see user accounts created in our database. So we'll open up a set of PHP tags so we can write our server-side scripts. I'm going to open my tag on line 4 and close it on line 6. I'm going to just lay out a series of comments. We'll lay out the steps that are happening before we actually write the code, and then we'll go through it one piece at a time. So step 1 will be store the user's form inputs in variables. And many of these things are things we've been doing basically since week 1 in the class. Week 2, we'll validate the inputs. Step 3, if the inputs are invalid, we want to show the user a descriptive error. If inputs are valid, connect to the database. set up the SQL insert command, execute the insert to save the new user, disconnect from the database, and show a confirmation. Okay, so here are all the things we're going to do on this page. The storing of our user inputs is fairly simple. We've done this many times through this course. I'm going to create 3 variables. I'll create a username variable. And we'll use our form post collection. So we're going to populate the username variable. Go back to my register page from our input that is also called username. So the first text input on our register form is called username. So we can reference that value with through the post array, and we'll store it in a variable. I'll set up a couple other variables. We'll set up a password variable, which we'll read from the password input. And I'll set up a third variable called confirm that will also get the second password entered by the user in the confirm input on our previous page. Save my change. I also want one more variable. I'm going to create a Boolean variable called OK. I'm going to default it to true. So we're going to use this variable to track if there are any problems with any of these inputs, if any of them are missing, or if the passwords don't match. In any of those scenarios, we want to toggle this OK variable from true to false. So let's validate our inputs one at a time. Say if empty, we'll use the PHP empty function that we've used many times. If our username is empty, we're going to set OK to false. I'm also going to set up one other variable. I'll call it error MSG for error message. And we'll initialize it as an empty string, so there is no error message text when we first start our code. But as soon as we encounter any error message, we want to write a description to our user into this variable. So we'll say error MSG, in this case, equals username is required. And I'm also going to add an HTML line break in here in case we have to add additional error messages. So there's our first validator. I'm going to check if our password variable is empty. And if the user didn't enter a password, again, we're going to set OK to false. This time I'm going to use .equals. I want to append on to the error message, because our error message might already say username is required. So now this time I want it to say, we're going to use plus equals, password is required. And again, we'll append a line break on. And now I want to check if the password and the confirm variables are the same. So if password is not equal to confirm, again, we're going to toggle OK to false. And we want to append on to our error message. So we'll use .equals passwords do not match. So now we validated the inputs, we can check our OK variable. If OK is equal to false, we want to show the error messages, all the error messages to the user in red. So if OK is equal to false, and remember we need double equals, here we're setting the value to false, here we're checking if OK is false. So we're going to use double equals. If OK, then we're going to echo, we want to print out, I'll print out a div tag, and we'll make it red. So we'll use the class alert danger. And then I want to append on our error message. And then we'll close the div. So if any one of these things is true, our username isn't entered, our password isn't entered, or the passwords don't match, we're going to print out a red alert banner across the top of the page with the error message. Let's try this out so far. So I'll load my register page. I'll put in, let's say test at test.com. And I'm going to put in 2 different passwords. So you can see the length of them is different. Here I've got an 8-character password. Here's a 9-character password. And when I click register, let's see what happens. So I get a red banner here, a red bar, saying passwords do not match in this case. So this is the result we want. I also want to add a link in here to go back. So after our div, I'm going to echo print a link. We'll use a little JavaScript to call history.go, which will take us back 1 page in the browser. It's kind of the same effect of clicking the browser's back button. So we'll add this link, keep my semicolon. So we're going to print out the div, and we're going to print a back button. That'll take the user back. So I'll just try that again. I'll just resubmit my same form inputs. And now I get a little link here that says back. When I click it, it takes me back 1 page in the browser. If my passwords do match, we won't get saved to the database yet, but I won't get any error. So that's the result we want here. So all the rest of this, we're going to wrap in an else, because this code is only going to happen if OK is true. So I'm going to move all of my comments inside these curly braces. So this is what happens if we got valid inputs from our users. So we're going to use our existing database connection in db.php. So we'll just require the database file that we created earlier in the course. Let's set up an SQL command. We want to insert into users our username and password, the values. And we're going to set up 2 placeholders, 2 parameters, so colon username and colon password. That defines our parameters, and we'll populate those in a minute. We'll create a new command object. By calling prepare on our database connection and passing in the SQL command we want to run. Now, before we can execute it, we're going to need to populate our username and password parameters, but we also want to hash our password. If I enter a password TEST1234, we want hashing to transform that into an unreadable string for extra security. So we're going to start binding our parameters. First, we're going to bind our username parameter to our username variable. And we set 50 characters in the database for the username. And we're going to do the same with the password, but instead of passing in our password in plain text, we are also going to hash it. So I'm going to create a new variable called password hash. And we're going to take our original password and we're going to convert it. So we're going to call the PHP password hash function. We're going to pass in our original password variable. And then we also have to supply an algorithm. So we're going to use password underscore default. And then we want to bind this parameter so we've got our password parameter here on line 38. We're going to fill it with our password hash. And we need to allow for 255 characters because the hash string can be up to 255 characters long. Then lastly, we'll execute the query. So this would go down here. We're going to set up our command, set up our SQL, populate the username from our form, hash the password, and then populate that into our password parameter and execute the query. We'll disconnect from the database. And lastly, we can set out an alert. I'll use alert success, which is a Bootstrap class. It'll give us some green text. Say user saved successfully. We'll end the div. And then on the next line, I'm also going to add a little link. And then we'll give them a link so that they can then access the login screen. So we'll try this out. When I go back here, I also want to add a heading at the top. Right under my main, we'll add an H1 that says user registration. So let's try it again. I'm going to go back to my register page, put in 2 different passwords, try to register. Now I get my heading, it says passwords do not match. So let's go back. This time I'll put in so I'm using the password test1234. I'll click register. And we got a little error. That's okay. We'll figure it out. It's a little syntax error on line 41. Whoops. Instead of brackets around my 50, that should just be a comma, and I can remove a round bracket. Same thing down here for param string. So this is actually separated with a comma. So I'll save the change and I'll just resubmit and resend. It says my registration is saved successfully. Gives me a link to my login screen. And now if I go back to MySQL Workbench and run my query again, we can now see I've got one user here, user ID 1, with my username test@test.com, and you can see how the password has been transformed by the hashing algorithm. So we can never unhash it or convert it back into its plain text form. So our code's mostly working. There's probably one other thing we should do here. Right now, the way our page is working, there's nothing to prevent me from creating a second user account with the same email address, the test@test.com. So what we should add for best practice, before we insert the user to the database and run this code, we probably should make sure that we don't already have a user with this username. So I'm going to add in one more check here. Check username doesn't already exist. So this code I'm going to indent because this is only going to happen if we don't find this user already. So we need another SQL command. First, we need a query. We need to select star from users where username equals, and we'll set up a username parameter that starts with a colon like all of our other parameters. We'll create a new command object. So we'll prepare our database connection to run this query. We've got to fill our username parameter. We're going to populate it with our username variable. And we'll set it up as a string parameter that's 50 characters long. We'll execute the query. And then we'll see what we get back. If we get something back from this query, it means we found a match in the database, the username already exists. So I'll set up a user variable. And by calling the fetch command on our command object, this will retrieve either an empty object if the user doesn't exist, or an existing user. So now we can check it. So if our user is not empty, well, in this case, we need to show a message to the user. So we can basically copy this line from above, and we'll just change the error message. In this case, we'll say username already exists. And we'll leave our link to go back. Then underneath here, we'll add an else clause. And this code, steps 5 and 6, I'm going to cut and paste these and now I'll save my changes again. So once we connect to the database, we're first going to check if we already have this user. If we do, we're going to show an error message. If we don't have them, then we're going to save. So I'm going to create, we'll try this again. So I'm going to save, go back, and I'm going to try to sign up with the exact same username, test@test.com. I'll click register. Whoops, okay, I didn't get my logic quite right. Let's see, did that save? Ah, okay. So in this case, our confirmation message also needs to be in here. Our confirmation message shouldn't happen And that's okay. That's the norm when we're programming and debugging. We try something, we get it doesn't work quite right. So my duplicate check did work, but our confirmation message showed up. So I'm going to change this to 7 and this to 8. We'll disconnect at the bottom. Take out some of my white spacing. Okay, I'm going to try that again. Try it until it's right. Okay, it tells me my username already exists. Well, what happens if I put in a unique username? I'll put in abc@abc.com. I'm actually going to use the same password, test1234. And now it tells me I was able to register successfully. When I go and look in the database, execute my query again, you'll notice I now have a new user. And even though I use the same password, this is what's great about our password hash, the value is unique. The first few characters are the same, but even when the plain text password is the same, every hash value is unique. This helps with our security. So that's it for this activity. In our next video, we're going to build the page that will process our user logins.